Hello, and welcome to Café Carmine with me, Luke. Today's subject is the issue surrounding aging politicians. I wish to posit that this is not a new phenomenon, but whereas in the past we would have pockets of elder statesmen, now it is becoming the norm. So much so, it is proven to weigh down on future generations and their ideals. In many respects, we can suggest, as a whole, we are living longer, and therefore it is expected, as a byproduct of this expectation, that we are living longer, and our longevity is a triumph of our race. However, and I'm sure many would agree, that there is a difference between our own individual longevity and the status quo remaining in the upper echelons of power for multiple decades. I wish to start this by talking about what I call the modern American dilemma, serving until the end. In many ways, the US is experiencing an entrenchment of its power. The core issue is that many elected officials lack any form of regulation or term limitation, making power acquisition a lifelong career goal, and one that will continue to only grow with each passing cycle that the politician sits. I think there's no really two better examples of lifelong politicians and career-long politicians than Strom Thurmond and Robert Byrd. Primarily here I'm going to focus on the idea of Strom Thurmond and his time as a member of the US Senate. He not only exemplifies the longevity of a member of the legislature, but also the idea of institutional mastery. His power wasn't just from the elections and the electoral system. It came from the accumulation of power from his seniority, his presence in committees, and his chairmanship, and having deep knowledge of a legislative process that, by this point of his career, if you look at towards the end, he would have been part of building. Strom has Dixiecratic roots, and was perhaps best known in 1957 for his combating of civil rights by having a 24-hour filibuster. A filibuster is where you would stand and continue to talk until effectively ensuring there was no chance for anyone to make a vote within the legislative branch. It is a tactic, it is an impressive one, not least because he spoke for 24 hours, and if you're wondering about how does a man do that, it requires a bucket, and we'll go no further than that. He never left the floor, which is impressive, but also maybe shows you a lot about his attitudes towards civil rights. His time in power shows you that even though he stood not only from his core beliefs, but would continue on to remain into the 2000s a member of the political system, that the system is incapable of pushing out these individuals. Whether he's still around is a different matter, but part of a system that has moved on and moved forwards a lot. He was sharing the floor with black individuals, and he would do everything in his power at the beginning of his career to ensure that they never, ever had a say or an equal voice to white people in America. If we fast forward to a more modern idea of what Strom was representing, especially towards the end, I think we can look at someone like Mitch McConnell, who has displayed cognitive recess and decline, and maybe an inability to be effective in front of camera. We have to accept that the media is a present part of US politics, and from that you have to be an effective politician in front of the camera too, and communicating your point to the audience, the electorate. This debate actually does tie into Dianne Feinstein. Sorry, she was a member of the U.S. Senate who pretty much refused to step down, despite her very clear declining health. She would eventually pass away in 2023 at the age of nearly 90, if I remember right, and she was very, very much, if not completely gone, but a shell of who she was. Refusing to relinquish power. And this actually does touch into another point. Who removes the individual? If the politician doesn't want to leave, there's no system to say you're too old or you're not mentally or physically capable of being here. Rather, the only way you can do it is to impeach him for immoral or improper behaviour politically. This, again, calls into question a system of problems. John Dingell is another individual that does come to mind when we think of longevity, serving for 59 years. Proof that the ultimate career, where the exit door is only really found through death, it's a very concerning element to it. But also there is a solidification of his power because his wife is now in his seat. So really we're getting a continuation of this individual even in death. The ideals of a man could be spread to his son, his daughter, his niece, his nephews, any figure in his family. Rather, this becomes a system of which, does it really just expire at the point of death? No, it could continue on. It can become ceremonial to pass it on to the spouse, almost like a monarchy, which is very concerning. To say the least, because this, if you will, inherited throne was not just for his wife, but actually for him too. John Dingell's father, John Dingell Sr., had stepped down, or had passed away in 1955. Don't quote me on that exactly. And obviously he himself would pass, and his wife Debbie would succeed him in 2015. If you're to actually look at the Dingell period, this is over 80 years of one family name controlling a seat. Now, yes, of course, there are family dynasties in politics. Look no further than the Kennedys, the Bushes, the Clintons, if you really want to be loose with it. I suppose the Adams would be maybe the best example as well, if you think about two presidents along with the Bushes. There is this idea of solidifying the family-controlled political seat. A Medici-esque behaviour, if you will, that is being put upon a 21st century state. I think if we're to look at longevity, and in more recent times, Ruth Bader Ginsburg really does come to mind as a individual who maybe overstayed, and as a result of this prolonged ceremony until their passing in 2020, had resulted in a much more weakening of her party, or at least her political representation in other branches, because it resulted in Donald Trump replacing her. If she had been more wise to the idea, she would have resigned under Obama to allow for a new individual to step in. But as she hadn't, it's demonstrably affected the Democrats, as they are outnumbered now in the Supreme Court. Could it be said that Ruth Bader Ginsburg prioritized her own political ambitions over that of the greater will or the bigger issue? Very much so. But none really touches upon this point more so in recent times than the Biden-Trump build-up to the election, both in 2020 and in 2024, which could be argued steps into a whole bigger argument, that is the crucible of the president, experience against stamina. This role, the executive role, often faces higher scrutiny, primarily because of its singularity and also because of the intensity of the demands. It's a public role, it's a political role, it is a role that makes deities of these figures in a country's history. So when we look at the likes of Biden and Trump, especially if we look at the 2024 election, two septuagenarians who are both in a way representative of a failing in US society. There is no ticket of the major two parties that does not have an elderly white man running. There was no new generation being pushed forwards. There was no offering of, if you will, fresh blood. And it was almost widely accepted that that was okay. Voters are often drawn back, and this is going to run as a key theme within this idea of the crucible of experience versus stamina, that we love a familiar face. We have seen these individuals, Trump and Biden, before. Both had been presidents. So it wasn't out of the realm of our minds, our imaginations. It wasn't something new and fresh, but actually something that served as incumbency in our own thoughts. They had dominated the landscape with their cult of personalities. Even then, this had suppressed younger voices. Whether they were right or wrong to do so is up for debate, but they had done that. The likes of other figures who were perhaps strong enough to survive this period also are much longer lasting figures in politics. They were people who've been around for 25 or 35 years, the likes of Hillary Clinton, who I would even argue, even though she herself was running for the first time as a president, she is a vessel of the Clinton brand, which goes back to 1993. Trump and Biden collectively dominated the American landscape for over a decade now, if you think about it, if you think back to the 2016 elections. And Biden's influence, you could probably even say, goes back to 2008 when he was the vice president under Obama. Speaking of familiar faces, I don't wish to get too caught up in a completely US-centric episode, be at least for the rest of my audience who will be screaming at me and pulling their hair out saying the world does not center around the USA, and no, it doesn't. We could look at someone like Lula da Silva. Obviously, this international parallel does have a interesting comparative to Trump and Biden. He has returned to power in spite of his advancing age, and demonstrates, if you will, that even in a democracy like Brazil, having a familiar face, even in a volatile state, there is also a problem with a lack of young, recognizable individuals as an alternative. So Lula coming to the fold does make sense. However, you could say that this is also something that Brazil seeks. They seek familiarity because they seek stability. They seek the status quo. There's something about it that we know that if we go for something, we know it's okay. And this will be a point that I think we can even look upon beyond that, which I'll come to a little bit later on. The historical brand, if you will, it serves as a almost like necessary anchor to what is needed. If we are to sort of consider the initial attempts at elections, it took Lula 4 attempts to become president. Now, most would say, well, after 3 attempts, should you really be running, you're standing in the way of other individuals. But actually, those attempts are important because it breeds familiarity. It breeds into the system this idea that I am part of it. You will remember me in a few years' time when it comes around to this cycle again. Remember, I'm still an option. Remember, I'm still an option. Remember, I'm still an option. And that could be from your grandparents to your parents to you. Maybe you grew up with Lula on TV and now he's up for election and you can go to the voting booth and select his name. It's a long game plan, but it is a good one all the same. Obviously, Lula's not alone in this. We do have other figures, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who also has been around for, well, he's been around now for over 90 years himself. and has been part of the Brazilian landscape for multiple decades. Again, does he run for president now? No, but he doesn't really need to. He was representative more of a period in the 90s for Brazil. But the sociologist has been part of the Brazilian spirit and story for decades in politics. Obviously, Brazil's situation prior to the mid-80s was that of a military junta. But how much could he have done if there had been a democracy prior to that? You could argue that he might have been a multi-time president, potentially. If we're to move to another part of the world, we could look at the Aquino family. You have Corazon and Ben, who were very prominent figures in their day. The continued relevance and the ability to draw upon these historical names can be very important. As to go back to what I was saying about with Dingle, you could also argue that Aquino has established themselves. That maybe it's not for everyone, but it is something you recognize. And the moment you know what you're getting. This can be very good for the electorate, sure, but it also has spelled problems for the Philippines and over-reliance on a dominant political family over the years, who some do admire, others detest, but for whatever else, they are recognizable, and that can be helpful on voting day. Now, to talk upon something I remarked at the beginning, that there is nothing really new about this, there isn't. There is nothing new under the political sun. It really just sort of proves that there has always been a timelessness to autocracy. I think the ultimate example of this is monarchy and autocrats. If you look at their indefinite rule, the idea and the mandate given to them that birth to death is what they are effectively designed to do, means that they are often trained to rule by the same person who is ruling. Monarchs train their next generation to become monarchs. For example, King Charles has been trained by Elizabeth II to become the next monarch. The crown never stops, it continues on. The moment the individual, in, let's say, recent times, Elizabeth II passing, immediately went to becoming King Charles, but the monarchy continues. The crown is still there, and it in this issuance and concern of maintenance of the status quo, they serve as a sort of stark contrast, if you will, where this power of absolute and hereditary form, only ending in death, could be compared to that of senators who only step down in death, and they themselves potentially, Dingle, pass it on to the next generation. If someone was to come forwards with the name Thurmond, and be of relation to Strom, it would be, if you will, a continuation of this dynasty. The Kennedys. Robert Kennedy did run on a ticket shortly after his brother's death. I'm sure if he had managed to stand, it would have been a very powerful ticket, nonetheless, because he has been around for a long time. Even if not himself, the Kennedys had been. If we're to look at something a little bit more palatable than monarchy, we probably could look at someone like Erlander, the Swedish Prime Minister for 23 years, introducing a very modern welfare state. This longevity, though, is perhaps a counterpoint, and could be argued for monarchy too. Some of the reasons people like it, be it sheikhs or kings or queens or long-serving public servants, is that it actually does create stability. Erlander is a very good example of stability. But should someone be serving for 23 years? It's questionable. He represents a problem as well as a benefit. You can be in a duality in this situation where you do serve both parts. And it really comes into this idea of the established brand. Political longevity means that we have both a brand established and a familiar face. The electorate is absolute in who they want to vote for. More often than not, I think people do go to the voting booth already knowing what they want out of the country. Even if the physical shell of the individual is not really the same as what it was 20, 30, 40 years prior, they will still maybe choose them as though they are at the height of their power still. And I think of two cases for this. The first one is Churchill. He was in politics for over 50 years. His career demonstrates the pull of national pride and triumph and destiny, and how indispensable he was to not just the Conservatives, but the entire system. It was the fact that he was a man who was caught up in being in this arena. And except for maybe the last decade of his life, he really didn't ever want to leave it. But like others, he was drawn to it, and people endorsed it. They did. They kept him in. And perhaps the reality was the only thing that stopped him was health that had become so depleting, and an inability to fight Eden and his cabal that was coming for him, that he realized it's better to go out on your own terms. Now, to look at another individual who definitely had this, one could look at Getúlio Vargas. Vargas was a president in two senses. One in the late 20s, early 30s, and then there was a dictatorship period that ran until 45. Following this period, he actually came back into the fold, which perhaps sounds strange to a lot of people, because why would, under a democratic process, when this man didn't really come to power originally under a non-democratic process, why would he come back into the fold, and why would people be okay with it? Because the established brand. He had represented, at one point, a good time in Brazil. And as a result, people chose him. And he would remain in power until things went very south in Brazil very quickly, and he was wearing his pajamas, and he was in Rio, and he had a gun in his hand. We'll leave it at that. It didn't end too well for him, let's put it that way. But even then, he still chose to leave the office by his own hand, and didn't ever have to see a day where he wasn't in power at the very end. Now, Churchill, Vargas, monarchs, even Erlander, they were all part of gerontocracy. When we look at the systemic reasons for the entrenchment of these old leaders, we have to consider what is really the power of seniority. We can reiterate that the idea of the legislative procedures, that power through committee control, procedure, budget allocation can all be strictly tied to one's tenure. In doing so, you can solidify your tenure. The systems that are created have a massive disincentive for younger members to challenge the old guard. If you look at the likes of a Pelosi, she isn't being challenged by an AOC figure, because there is no reason for AOC to challenge her. She has to accept her because Pelosi is part of it. She has probably been around longer than many of the chairs in the room. Same with Bernie Sanders. I know many people like Bernie, but he is part of that as well. He has got seniority, and it guarantees him that the powers that be will remain powerful for decades. Following on from this idea of power seniority, we could consider Robert Michel's concept of the iron law of oligarchy. It's a complex political idea of that all organizations inevitably consolidate their power in the hands of a small self-serving elite. That no matter what organization comes forwards, they will be usurped or absorbed by the elite. Often these are elder statesmen and maybe the most entrenched members of these systems, rendering that any true grass movements will become squashed pushed out to the side, and if not, they kind of become part of the system, but in a more, if you will, less true form of what they were originally. They are much more pasteurized and buried under the bureaucracy of the system and tailored to being that can be serving to that elite. This is what happens to a lot of movements when you look at them. Think of any grassroots movement you've seen, and if it has been incorporated, it's probably the original individuals have been pushed aside, they have found scandals or found something else about the individuals involved, and that idea has been taken and given to the elite to push forwards and be a champion of. Does it make it a bad thing or a good thing? No, it's just what happens. It's what Robert Michels writes about. And there is, from this, a Weberian link to it. Max Weber's work strongly reinforces this idea of bureaucracy. Weber did believe that bureaucracy was the most efficient form of administration, but it was also maybe an indestructible machine that only really knew how to deal with rules and regulations. If you think of the oligarchical fusion that the Iron Law represents of long-serving political figures, with the technical indispensable power that comes from the likes of Weber's ideas, that there is a permanent administrative structure, these entrenched leaderships are virtually unassailable. They cannot be broken down because the system builds upon them and they build upon the system. It is a vicious cycle in which it will never stop. And from Weber's point, it is the most effective, hence why we continue to do it. There is maybe a further point about the system if we're to step away from just pure bureaucracy. There is the idea of the judicial lifetime appointment. This one in particular, I kind of want to categorize separately. Going off the Ruth Bader Ginsburg example about how judicial systems intended to sort of have a political safeguarding by being anti-political, lifetime tenure, it actually as a result becomes incredibly political, with retiring figures based purely on how should I explain this, sort of a correct partisan successor. They will wait, but in many essence they won't wait. They will allow themselves to die for their own selfish political wants, and they do not choose to step down when maybe it is better, when the sun is at its best and when you can see that there is still an opportunity to find a new figure. They will continue on, despite mental faculty declining and physical state perhaps declining too. And really, in a way, this goes on to the human element. Why relinquishing power is not only hard, but there are psychological and cultural dimensions to this. If we reflect upon Erikson's work on generativity and stagnation, in many of the later lives of political figures, there is this argument of generativity. Do you guide the next generation and solidify your legacy, or do you pursue one's own stagnation? By stagnation, he means about becoming entrenched in your own world and your own legacy, and you sort of, if you will, become irrelevant. Holding onto power can be both conscious and subconscious. It's not something you actively maybe pursue, but it ends up being that way. I think, if you will, someone like Vargas and Churchill probably didn't really consciously actively think about their things. They just were addicted to it. They didn't really think about their legacies. They just were concerned about being back in office because they truly enjoyed it. The only way to really satisfy us, though, as people, if you will, the idea of pursuing generativity is the idea of being able to say, I am okay with my work. I am okay with this and what I've done. However, this is not something that they can do. Many will rationalize it as only I can finish this work, to quote Erikson. And thus, they are unable to maybe avoid this fear of stagnation, because they believe that they are the only ones that can truly let go of it. And they have to separate themselves from this idea that there is a point that they will always look at their work and say, I am the only one that can do it, where it's never really their work. But this ties into the mindset that many politicians are. They are very, very, very self-centered, very self-absorbed, and very arrogant individuals. From Erikson's work, and obviously we talked about Machiavelli's, but I would also say about Machiavelli as well, about how ambition and the nature of man, Machiavelli viewed ambition and the desire to acquire as almost like a fundamental human desire. It's inexhaustible. Ambition comes differently, or is sourced differently and manifested differently by different social classes. Great nobles are driven by ambition to command and oppress, according to Machiavelli. The individual ruler must be, by their own virtue, if you will, from il principe, the prince, a combination of skill, foresight, and drive, and to successfully manage the volatile forces of fortuna, you must also ensure that you control and be aware of the nature of man as well. The prince, if you will, the individual, the politician, therefore acts immorally. Hence why we have the term Machiavellian, where necessary, prioritizing the security and the power of the state, and thus their own rule, over any sort of ethical direction. They will contradict themselves. If we look at the moment, there are many individuals who are bowing down to Trump. This is a good example. There are people who bow down to Putin in Russia because of the fact that when they weigh it down, they will continue to want to maintain their power. Because ultimately, man is governed by his own self-interest, according to Machiavelli. Now, there is even more we could explore with this. The engine of the egoism by Hobbes. Hobbes argued that we all, me, you, and everyone else under the sun, we are seemingly altruistic in our acts. We don't really, we are, if you will, in spite of this, we are motivated by self-interest, the pursuit that our own desires, and we are constantly trying to avoid pain and death. We don't want pain. We don't want death. If you will, even something as simple as pity as an emotion is explained as in imagining a singular sort of misfortune befalling oneself. We look at others and go, oh no, what a terrible thing to happen to someone. Why? Because we pity them. Why? Because we wouldn't want it to happen to ourselves. Again, self-interest. We have an appetite, though, and aversion. Human life is a perpetual cycle of vital motions and voluntary motions. We are governed by our appetite. By this, I mean pleasure and survival. And aversion, which is the idea of pushing away from death, to reject death and pain. And as a result, Hobbes did touch upon the idea that the universal egoism leads to, without a common power that would lead to a war of all against all, where everything will become a mess, if you will, a Mad Max situation, a dystopia. Now, to escape chaotic existence, Hobbes, and, if you will, our rational egoists, we agree to form a social contract from this, and surrendering our individual freedoms to an absolute sovereign. In his case, we refer to him instead of a prince, the Leviathan, to ensure that we have self-preservation and peace. That's why we give ourselves to monarchy at the time, if you will. So the Tsarist Russia, if you will, the emperors of Austria and empresses, and in the UK, kings and queens. This political structure is almost necessary for control mechanisms for inherently selfish individuals. And in many ways, we can look at today and see that they have similar problems. That there is this empirical ego, leading into Kant, and the ideas of what the phenomenal self is. We are, if you will, empirical, observable, self-defined by our experiences and actions in this world. For the aging politician, this self is almost entirely defined by one's own political and public role and power. Stepping down is the eradication and the annihilation and of the only self that we have ever known, making prospects psychologically terrifying. In fact, we could even point to this idea of our fears and our empirical ego being tied into a more loving respect of it. It's an amour de soi, a love of oneself. That public validation is overshadowed by the natural self-love, amour de soi, and retirement really eliminates the source of this social validation, according to Rousseau. So in many respects, there is a deeply psychological, political theory behind the idea of why politicians continue to remain as such. And for a lot of politicians, the end of service, the cost of stepping down, is not easy. We could look at what happens when one leaves office, and it comes down to three categories. The short-lived retirements, for example, if we look at someone like de Gaulle, Lyndon B. Johnson, George Washington, Willy Brandt, they all suggest that the intense purpose and structure of high office were, in some ways, what was keeping them alive. They all passed shortly afterwards. The loss of that structure and stress maybe makes them have a rapid decline. It's a bit like losing a partner for them. There was a duality, a Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Frankenstein and the modern Prometheus. And even before these individuals, there is, if you will, their longer term ones, the post-political lives of someone like James Monroe or Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. They were also brief, demonstrating that this phenomenon is cross-cultural and pre-modern. And then, if you will, like out of Pandora's box, there is hope. And I think there is no better example of this than Jimmy Carter. What I like to call the true exit. Whereas someone like Reagan, who did step away from office, really was not the same individual, ultimately succumbing to long-term effects of dementia after being in office. Jimmy Carter is of big impact. He not only retired from politics, but had managed to reinvent himself for the purpose of humanitarian work. If you look at something like his work with election monitoring, Habitat for Humanity, and he had managed to, in a sense of it, achieve from generosity, step outside of the political arena. He had shown it was possible to trade the power of state for a bigger global impact. I hope you have enjoyed today's episode. My name is Luke, as always, and this has been a discussion on the dilemmas that we're facing with aging politicians. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to give it on whatever platform you're seeing it on a like, share it if you wish to, if you agree with it. If you don't agree with it, please leave a comment. I don't know what my next subject will be yet, but I do look forward to hearing it from everyone. And until next time, look after yourselves.